Pack your bags, Vivian. I'm done pretending this marriage means anything to me. The words hit Vivian Grace Montgomery like a physical blow, causing her to drop the crystal water glass she'd been holding. It shattered against the marble floor of their Manhattan penthouse, the sound echoing through the silence that followed Richard's devastating announcement. 8 months pregnant. Vivian struggled to process what her millionaire ex-husband-to-be had just said. Her swollen belly made it difficult to bend and clean up the broken glass. But she tried anyway, her hands shaking as she gathered the sharp fragments. "Don't," Richard Sterling Blackwood commanded from across their pristine living room. At 42, he still cut an imposing figure in his tailored Italian suit, his dark hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. "The maid will handle it tomorrow." "The maid will handle it tomorrow," Vivian repeated numbly, still crouched on the floor. "Like she'll handle everything else after you abandon your pregnant wife." Richard's jaw tightened. "This isn't abandonment, Vivian. This is me finally being honest about what this marriage has become. You've gotten comfortable, complacent. You've let yourself go." Vivian's hand instinctively moved to her rounded stomach, where their daughter had been kicking more frequently lately, as if sensing the tension that had been building in their home for months. "I'm carrying your child, Richard. I'm supposed to look pregnant." "It's not just the pregnancy," Richard said, his voice cold and calculated. "It's everything. You've become boring, predictable. You spend your days reading books and visiting museums. You have no ambition, no drive. You're content to live off my success without contributing anything meaningful to our life together." The narcissistic abuse in his words was clear to Vivian now, though she'd been making excuses for his behavior for months. How had she been so blind to the man he really was? "I have a master's degree in art history," she said quietly, struggling to stand. "I worked at the Metropolitan Museum before we married. I gave up my career because you asked me to focus on our family." "And what family would that be?" Richard's voice turned bitter. "You can barely host a decent dinner party. You embarrass me at social events with your naive opinions and outdated clothes. Do you have any idea what my colleagues think when they see me with you?" Vivian felt tears threatening, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Instead, she focused on the pain in her lower back and the baby's movements, reminding herself that she wasn't alone in this. "So what exactly are you saying, Richard?" "I'm saying I found someone who appreciates what I can offer, someone who shares my vision for the future, who understands the importance of image and success in our social circle." The words hung in the air like poison. Vivian sank onto the white leather sofa, her mind racing to process the implications. "You're having an affair." "I'm exploring options," Richard corrected, as if the distinction mattered. "Amber is everything you're not, Vivian. She's young, vibrant, ambitious. She makes me feel alive again." "Amber," Vivian repeated, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. "How long?" "Does it matter? The point is, I've made my decision. I've already spoken to my attorneys about the divorce settlement. I'll be fair. Of course, you'll have enough to live comfortably with the baby." Vivian's breath caught. He'd already consulted lawyers. This wasn't a sudden decision born from a moment of anger. This was a calculated plan he'd been developing while she slept beside him every night, trusting him completely. "You planned this," she whispered. "While I've been worried about nursery colors and baby names, you've been planning to leave us." Richard straightened his tie, a gesture she'd once found endearing, but now recognized as a nervous habit he displayed when he was lying. "I've been thinking about our future. Yes, and I've realized we don't have one together. Not the kind of future I want. Anyway, what about the baby? She's your daughter too." "Of course, I'll take care of my responsibilities," Richard said dismissively. "Child support, visitation rights when appropriate. But let's be realistic. Vivian, you'll be better suited to handle the day-to-day childcare. Amber and I have plans that don't include changing diapers and midnight feedings." The casual way he discussed abandoning their unborn child made Vivian's stomach turn. This was a side of Richard she'd never seen before, or perhaps had refused to see. The successful tech entrepreneur she'd fallen in love with 5 years ago had revealed himself to be nothing more than a selfish narcissist who viewed his family as inconveniences to be managed. "Where will I go?" she asked, hating how small her voice sounded. "That's your problem to solve," Richard replied, checking his expensive Rolex. "I'll be staying at the club tonight. I expect you to pack your essentials and be gone by the time I return tomorrow evening. You can arrange for movers to collect the rest of your belongings once we formalize the separation." Vivian watched in stunned silence as her millionaire ex-husband gathered his briefcase and headed toward the door. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when she was so close to giving birth to their daughter. "Richard, wait," she called out desperately. "We can work through this. Marriage counseling, therapy, whatever you need. Don't throw away 5 years because of some midlife crisis." He paused at the door, his hand on the crystal doorknob. For a moment, Vivian thought she saw a flicker of doubt cross his features. Then his expression hardened again. "This isn't a midlife crisis. Vivian, this is me finally admitting that I settled for less than I deserved. Amber makes me realize what I've been missing all these years." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Vivian alone in the cavernous penthouse that had never felt like a real home. She sat in the oppressive silence, one hand on her belly, trying to comprehend that her entire world had just collapsed in the span of 15 minutes. Her phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, hope fluttered in her chest. Maybe Richard had realized his mistake and was coming back to apologize. But when she looked at the screen, her heart sank even further. The message was meant for someone named Amber. "It's done. She's packing tonight. We can finally start our real life together. Can't wait to celebrate with you tomorrow. My love." Richard had accidentally sent the message to Vivian instead of his mistress. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She was learning about her husband's true feelings through a text meant for another woman. Vivian clutched the phone to her chest and finally allowed herself to cry, her tears falling onto her swollen belly where their daughter continued to kick, blissfully unaware that her father had just walked out on both of them before she was even born. The next morning, Vivian sat surrounded by half-packed boxes in what had been their bedroom, her phone pressed to her ear as she sobbed to her best friend Maureen Hayes. "He actually said I'd embarrass him at social events." Maureen's voice was filled with outrage. "Vivian, you're the most elegant woman I know. You have more class in your little finger than Richard has in his entire narcissistic personality." "Maybe he's right, though," Vivian said, wiping her nose with a tissue. "Maybe I did get too comfortable. Maybe I stopped trying to be the woman he fell in love with." "Stop it right now," Maureen commanded firmly. "Don't you dare blame yourself for his narcissistic abuse. This is not about you getting comfortable. This is about him being a selfish, cruel man who's too immature to handle the responsibility of a family." Vivian shifted uncomfortably on the bed, her back aching from the stress and her advanced pregnancy. "I keep thinking about how we met, Maureen. Maybe there were signs I ignored." She closed her eyes and let her mind drift back 5 years to that charity gala at the Plaza Hotel. She'd been working as a curator at the Metropolitan Museum then, living in a modest apartment on the Upper West Side. She'd saved for months to afford the dress she wore that night, a simple black cocktail dress that cost more than her monthly grocery budget. Richard had approached her during the silent auction, charming and confident in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. "That Monet sketch you're bidding on," he'd said with a smile that made her heart flutter. "Most people don't appreciate the preliminary work that goes into the final masterpiece. Most people only see the end result," Vivian had replied, surprised by his genuine interest in art. "They don't understand that sometimes the sketch reveals more about the artist's true vision than the finished painting." They'd talked for hours that night about art, literature, and philosophy. Richard had seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and opinions, asking thoughtful questions about her work at the museum. When he'd asked for her number, she'd felt like Cinderella at the ball. "You know what I remember most about that first night," Vivian said to Maureen now. "He seemed so interested in my mind, not just my appearance. He asked about my master's thesis, my favorite exhibits at the museum. I thought I'd found someone who valued intelligence and substance." "And maybe he did, back then," Maureen replied gently. "People change. Honey, success and money can corrupt even good people. But that doesn't mean you were wrong to fall in love with who he was then." Vivian stood up slowly and walked to the window overlooking Central Park. In the early morning light, she could see joggers and dog walkers beginning their daily routines, their lives continuing normally while hers fell apart. "The worst part is how stupid I feel," she admitted. I never questioned why he was so eager for me to quit my job after we got married. I thought it was romantic, the successful businessman who wanted to take care of his wife. But really, he was isolating me, making me financially dependent on him. That's classic narcissistic behavior, Maureen said. They want to control every aspect of your life. Did he ever discourage you from maintaining friendships or pursuing your interests? Vivian thought about it. He did seem irritated when I spent time with you or my other friends from the museum. He'd always have some important event or dinner party the same nights I made plans. And whenever I mentioned wanting to volunteer or maybe teach art classes, he'd say we were too busy with his social obligations. He was systematically isolating you. Vivian, this isn't your fault. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Vivian's heart leaped. Had Richard come back? But when she looked through the peephole, she saw a young woman with platinum blonde hair in designer clothes. Maureen, I have to go. Someone's at the door. Vivian opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged. Can I help you? The woman smiled with perfectly white teeth. You must be Vivian. I'm Amber Patterson. I think we should talk. Vivian's blood ran cold. This was Richard's mistress, standing at her door with the confidence of someone who'd already won. She was everything Richard had said, young, probably 24 or 25, with the kind of effortless beauty that made Vivian acutely aware of her swollen ankles and unwashed hair. I don't think we have anything to discuss, Vivian said, starting to close the door. Oh, but we do, Amber said, holding up a set of keys. These are to Richard's penthouse, the one he's buying for us. I thought you might want to know that he's already moved most of his important belongings there. The words hit Vivian like a physical blow. Richard hadn't just been planning this divorce, he'd been planning his entire new life without her. While she'd been picking out paint colors for the nursery, he'd been buying a love nest for his mistress. Why are you telling me this? Vivian asked. Amber's smile turned predatory. Because I want you to understand that this isn't some temporary fling. Richard and I have been together for 6 months. We have real plans for our future together. I'm not going anywhere. 6 months. Vivian did the math in her head. Richard had started his affair right around the time they'd found out the baby was a girl, when Vivian had been most excited about starting their family. He's having a baby with me, Vivian said weakly, hating how desperate she sounded. And that's unfortunate, Amber replied with fake sympathy. But Richard and I have discussed it. He's willing to do his duty as far as child support goes, but he wants a fresh start, with someone who can give him the life he really wants. Vivian felt her knees weaken. She gripped the doorframe for support, her free hand instinctively protecting her belly. I know this is hard to hear, Amber continued, her voice sickeningly sweet. But really, didn't you know this was coming? I mean, look at yourself. Honey, look at what you've become. Richard is a powerful, successful man who needs a partner who can match his energy and ambition. Someone who can be an asset to his career, not a liability. Get away from my door, Vivian managed to say. I'm just trying to help you understand the reality of the situation, Amber said. Richard told me you might try to fight the divorce or make things difficult. I wanted to speak to you woman to woman so you'd know that's pointless. He's already moved on, emotionally and financially. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for everyone. Vivian slammed the door shut and immediately slid the deadbolt into place. She could hear Amber's laughter through the door, a sound that would haunt her for weeks to come. Leaning against the door, Vivian slid down to the floor and hugged her knees to her chest as much as her pregnancy would allow. This was her lowest moment, abandoned by her millionaire ex-husband, humiliated by his mistress, 8 months pregnant with nowhere to go. But as she sat there on the cold marble floor, something began to shift inside her. Beneath the pain and humiliation, a small flame of anger began to burn. How dare Richard treat her like a discarded toy? How dare this Amber woman come to her home and gloat about stealing her husband? Vivian had been raised to be polite, accommodating, and grateful for whatever she was given. But carrying her daughter had awakened something fierce and protective in her. She wouldn't let her child grow up thinking it was acceptable for people to treat her mother with such cruelty and disrespect. For the first time since Richard's announcement, Vivian began to think clearly. She had options he didn't know about, resources he'd never imagined. Her millionaire ex-husband thought he held all the cards, but he was wrong. It was time to call her grandmother. That evening, Vivian found herself standing outside Meridian Club, an exclusive bar in Midtown where Manhattan's elite gathered to see and be seen. According to the business card she'd found in Richard's jacket pocket, this was where Amber Patterson worked as a bartender. Vivian had spent the afternoon wrestling with whether to confront the other woman. Every rational part of her brain said to stay home, pack her belongings, and begin the process of rebuilding her life. But the fierce protective instinct she'd developed since becoming pregnant demanded answers. She needed to understand what kind of woman could so callously destroy a marriage and mock a pregnant wife. The hostess at Meridian looked Vivian up and down with barely concealed disdain. Even in her best maternity dress and carefully applied makeup, Vivian felt frumpy and out of place among the perfectly styled women who populated Richard's world. "I'm looking for Amber Patterson," Vivian said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Amber's behind the main bar," the hostess replied with a smirk. "Though I should warn you, she's pretty busy tonight. Big spender in town keeping her occupied." Vivian's stomach clenched. She knew exactly who that big spender was. The main bar area was dimly lit with soft jazz playing in the background. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over the mahogany surfaces and leather seating. This was the kind of place Richard brought clients to impress them with his success and sophistication. Now Vivian understood it was also where he'd been conducting his affair. Amber stood behind the polished bar, her platinum hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She wore a form-fitting black dress that hugged her petite figure perfectly. In the flattering lighting, she looked like a movie star, all sharp cheekbones and glossy lips. She was laughing at something someone had said, her head thrown back in apparent delight. Vivian followed Amber's gaze and felt her heart stop. Richard sat at the far end of the bar, still in his business suit but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He looked relaxed and happy in a way Vivian hadn't seen in months. On the bar in front of him sat a small velvet jewelry box. "Can I help you?" Amber asked, noticing Vivian's approach. Her voice was professional, but her eyes held a glint of recognition and satisfaction. "I want to talk to you," Vivian said quietly, not wanting to make a scene. Amber glanced toward Richard, who hadn't noticed Vivian yet. "Ladies' room is down the hall. I'll meet you there in 5 minutes." The ladies' room at Meridian was as luxurious as the rest of the establishment, with marble surfaces and crystal fixtures. Vivian stood in front of the mirror, trying to compose herself. Her reflection showed a tired, pregnant woman with shadows under her eyes and stress lines around her mouth. How could she compete with someone like Amber? When Amber entered, she immediately checked her appearance in the mirror, touching up her lip gloss with practiced efficiency. "So," Amber said, turning to face Vivian, "I'm surprised you came here. Richard said you were more the type to suffer in silence." "I needed to understand," Vivian replied. "What kind of woman breaks up a marriage when there's a baby involved?" Amber laughed, the same musical sound Vivian had heard from across the bar. "Oh, honey, I didn't break up anything. Your marriage was already over. Richard told me you two hadn't been intimate in months. He said you'd become more like roommates than lovers." The words stung because they contained a grain of truth. Vivian's pregnancy had been difficult, with constant nausea and fatigue. Their physical relationship had indeed suffered, but she'd assumed that was normal for expectant couples. "We're having a baby together," Vivian said, her hand moving protectively to her stomach. "And that's lovely for you," Amber replied with mock sweetness. "But Richard and I are planning a real future together, not some obligation based on an unplanned pregnancy." "Unplanned." Vivian's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. "We tried for 2 years to get pregnant. Richard said he wanted to start a family." Amber's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. Then she shrugged. "Well, people change their minds. Richard realized he wasn't ready for the suburban family life. He wants adventure, excitement, travel. All the things you can't give him now that you're tied down with a baby." "How long have you known him?" Vivian asked. 6 months, Amber said proudly. "And in that time, he's shown me more of the world than most women see in a lifetime. Paris last month, the Hamptons every weekend, that adorable little place he bought in Aspen." Each revelation felt like another knife to Vivian's heart, while she'd been home dealing with morning sickness and doctor's appointments. Richard had been living a completely separate life with another woman. He bought you a place in Aspen. It's in both our names, Amber said, examining her manicured nails. Richard says it's important for a couple to build assets together. Something about tax benefits. Though honestly, I don't worry about those details. That's what accountants are for. Vivian felt dizzy. The casual way Amber discussed shared property while Vivian was being kicked out of her own home was surreal. What about the jewelry box I saw out there? Amber's smile turned triumphant. Oh, that. Richard has been so generous. This is just a little something to celebrate our 6-month anniversary. Want to see? Before Vivian could respond, Amber had pulled a small velvet box from her purse. Inside nestled a stunning diamond necklace, easily worth $50,000 or more. It was the same receipt Vivian had found in Richard's jacket. She'd hoped it might be a push present for after the baby was born. It's beautiful, Vivian whispered, unable to hide her pain. Richard has excellent taste, Amber said, fastening the necklace around her throat. He says I deserve beautiful things because I make him feel young and alive again, not tired and burdened like... She trailed off with false embarrassment. Like his pregnant wife, Vivian finished. Well, you said it, not me, Amber replied with a shrug. Look, I'm not trying to be cruel here, but you have to understand Richard's position. He's at the peak of his career, moving in circles where image matters. He needs a partner who can enhance his reputation, not someone who shows up to galas looking like she raided the clearance rack at a department store. The narcissistic abuse was breathtaking in its casualness. Amber delivered each insult with a smile, as if she were offering helpful advice rather than systematically destroying Vivian's self-esteem. I'm 8 months pregnant, Vivian said quietly. Of course I don't look the same as I did a year ago. And that's exactly the problem, Amber replied. Richard doesn't want to spend the next 18 years watching you get more tired, more boring, more focused on childcare than on being a wife. He wants a partner who will grow with him, not someone who's given up on herself. I haven't given up on myself. I'm creating a life. And that's admirable. It really is, Amber said with false sincerity. But it's not the life Richard wants anymore. He's realized he can have so much more with someone who shares his vision for the future. Vivian stared at this young woman who spoke so confidently about stealing another woman's husband. Don't you feel any guilt at all about what you're doing to our family? Amber's expression hardened. Guilt for what? For making a successful man happy, for giving him the excitement and passion he was missing in his marriage? Richard told me you two were essentially living like brother and sister. I gave him back his youth, his enthusiasm for life. If anything, you should be thanking me for setting him free to be himself again. And what about our daughter? Doesn't she deserve to have her father in her life? Oh, Richard will do his duty, Amber said dismissively. Child support, the occasional visit. But let's be realistic. Men like Richard aren't meant for diaper duty and bedtime stories. He's meant for bigger things. I understand that about him, which is why our relationship works. Vivian felt tears threatening again, but she refused to give Amber the satisfaction of seeing her cry. You're making a mistake if you think Richard won't get tired of you too. If he could abandon his pregnant wife, what makes you think you're special? For the first time, Amber's confident mask slipped slightly. Because I'm not naive enough to think marriage is about unconditional love and growing old together. I know it's a partnership, a business arrangement. I bring value to Richard's life, and he brings value to mine. As long as we both keep up our end of the bargain, we'll be fine. And when you get older, when you're no longer the young, exciting mistress, Amber's smile returned, colder than before. By then, I'll have secured my position in ways you never bothered to. Richard and I are building something together. Investments, properties, shared interests. I'm not just sitting around waiting to be taken care of like some 1950s housewife. The implication was clear. Vivian had been a passive participant in her own marriage, while Amber was actively building a future with Richard. It was another carefully aimed blow, designed to make Vivian question her own worth and choices. I should get back, Amber said, checking her appearance in the mirror one final time. Richard's probably wondering where I am. We have dinner reservations at Daniel tonight, then we're flying to Miami tomorrow for the weekend. Richard says I need to work on my tan before we go to Monaco next month. She paused at the door, turning back to Vivian with what might have been genuine pity. Look, I know this is hard for you, but maybe it's time to think about what you really want from life. You're still young enough to start over. Find someone who actually wants the suburban mom lifestyle you're offering. Richard just isn't that man anymore. After Amber left, Vivian remained in the ladies' room for several more minutes, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, defeated, humiliated, and utterly lost. But as she stood there, her daughter kicked forcefully, as if reminding her that she wasn't alone in this fight. Vivian placed both hands on her belly and made a silent promise to her unborn child this wouldn't be the end of their story. It was just the beginning. The next morning, Vivian drove her modest sedan along the winding roads of the Hamptons, trying to calm her nerves before seeing her grandmother for the first time in 6 months. Dorothy Mae Montgomery lived on a sprawling estate that had been in their family for 3 generations. Though Vivian had never fully understood the extent of her grandmother's wealth or influence, as she pulled through the ornate iron gates, Vivian marveled at the perfectly manicured grounds. The main house was an elegant colonial with white columns and sprawling porches, surrounded by mature oak trees and carefully tended gardens. It looked like something from a magazine spread about old American money. Dorothy was waiting on the front porch when Vivian's car came to a stop. At 67, she was still a striking woman with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She wore a simple cashmere cardigan and pearls, the uniform of women who were so secure in their status they didn't need to advertise it. "My dear girl," Dorothy said, enveloping Vivian in a warm embrace that smelled of Chanel and lavender. "You look exhausted. Come inside immediately." The interior of Dorothy's home was a masterclass in understated luxury. Antique furniture mixed with carefully chosen modern pieces, fresh flowers filled crystal vases, and original artwork adorned the walls. Everything spoke of refined taste and significant financial resources, though it was all done with such subtlety that visitors might not immediately recognize the extent of the wealth on display. Dorothy led Vivian to a comfortable sitting room overlooking the gardens. A tea service was already waiting, along with small sandwiches and pastries. "Now then," Dorothy said, settling into her favorite chair and fixing Vivian with those penetrating blue eyes. "Tell me everything about that husband of yours." Vivian had planned to ease into the conversation gradually, but something about her grandmother's direct approach broke down her defenses. The whole story poured out: Richard's cruel announcement, Amber's gloating visit, the humiliating confrontation at the bar. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her face. Dorothy listened without interruption, her expression growing progressively darker as Vivian spoke. When the story was complete, she set down her teacup with deliberate precision. "That man is a fool," Dorothy declared with quiet fury. "And that little trollop he's taken up with is nothing but a common gold digger. Though I must say, she's shown more strategic thinking than you have, my dear." "Grandmother," Vivian protested, stung by the criticism. "Oh, don't look at me like that," Dorothy said, waving a dismissive hand. "I'm not blaming you for his behavior, but I am questioning why you've allowed yourself to become so dependent on a man who clearly doesn't deserve your trust." Dorothy stood and walked to an antique secretary desk in the corner of the room. She pulled out a thick folder and returned to her chair, placing it on the coffee table between them. "I've been keeping an eye on your Richard for some time," Dorothy said. "Something about him never sat right with me. Too smooth, too eager to impress. Men like that usually have something to hide." "You've been investigating Richard." "I've been protecting my family's interests," Dorothy corrected. "And right now, that means protecting you and my great-granddaughter from a man who's proven himself to be completely untrustworthy." She opened the folder to reveal a stack of financial documents, newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be private investigator reports. "Your millionaire ex-husband isn't quite as successful as he pretends to be," Dorothy said, pulling out a balance sheet. "His company has been hemorrhaging money for the past 2 years. The lavish lifestyle he's been maintaining is funded almost entirely by debt and increasingly risky investments." "Sakura," Vivian leaned forward to examine the documents. "How did you get these?" "When you have the right connections and sufficient motivation, financial information isn't as private as people think," Dorothy replied cryptically. "The point is, Richard has been living far beyond his means for some time. The penthouse, the cars, those expensive gifts for his mistress. It's all been financed by borrowing against future earnings that may never materialize. But his company is worth millions. He's always talking about major deals and expansion plans. Dorothy pulled out another document. His company is indeed valued at several $1 million on paper. But most of that value is speculative, based on projected growth that hasn't materialized. Meanwhile, he's taken on enormous debt to fund his acquisitions and maintain his public image. If those projections don't pan out, he could lose everything. Vivian felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her was horrified to learn about Richard's financial instability, especially with a baby coming. But another part felt a small thrill of vindication. Maybe his cruel abandonment wasn't about her inadequacy after all. "There's more," Dorothy continued, pulling out a series of photographs. "Your Richard has been trying to secure diamond suppliers for a new jewelry venture he's planning to launch with his mistress. Apparently, she's convinced him that her natural beauty combined with his business acumen will make them the next power couple in luxury retail." The photographs showed Richard and Amber at various jewelry trade shows and supplier meetings. In every image, Amber was draped in expensive jewelry and designer clothes, playing the role of the sophisticated entrepreneur's wife. "The irony," Dorothy said with a slight smile, "is that he's been unknowingly trying to buy diamonds from our family's company. My business manager has been fielding inquiries from his people for weeks." "Your business manager?" Dorothy's smile widened. "Oh, my dear, there's so much you don't know about your own family. I think it's time we fix that." She stood and walked to a large oil painting of a landscape scene. To Vivian's amazement, the painting swung aside to reveal a wall safe. Dorothy's fingers moved quickly over the electronic keypad, and the safe opened with a soft click. From inside, she pulled out another folder, this one bound in expensive leather. She returned to her chair and handed it to Vivian. "Open it," Dorothy instructed. Inside, Vivian found documents that made her head spin. Stock certificates, property deeds, bank statements showing balances with more zeros than she'd ever imagined. At the top of each document was the same name, Montgomery Diamond Enterprises. "I don't understand," Vivian said, looking up at her grandmother. "Your great-great-grandfather started mining diamonds in South Africa in 1890, Dorothy explained. "By the time your great-grandfather inherited the business, we had mining operations on 3 continents. Your grandfather expanded into cutting and retail, but he preferred to work behind the scenes. We've been supplying diamonds to major jewelry houses for over 70 years, but always through intermediaries. Very few people know the Montgomery name is behind some of the world's most prestigious diamond jewelry." Vivian stared at the documents, trying to process what she was seeing. "But you've always lived so modestly. I mean, this house is beautiful, but it's not ostentatious," Dorothy finished. "Vulgar. No, it's not. Real wealth doesn't need to advertise itself. My dear, we learned long ago that discretion is far more valuable than display. Let the nouveau riche build their gaudy monuments to insecurity. We prefer to maintain our privacy and our influence." "How much?" Vivian began, then stopped, unsure how to ask such a direct question. "How much are you worth?" Dorothy asked gently. "According to the trust fund your grandfather established for you, approximately $800 million, give or take a few million, depending on market fluctuations." The number was so large that Vivian couldn't initially comprehend it. $800 million. More money than she could spend in several lifetimes. More than Richard's company was worth. More than most people could even imagine. "I'm a millionaire," she whispered. "You're significantly more than a millionaire, darling. You're one of the wealthiest women in America. You just never knew it." Vivian felt dizzy. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me work at the museum for $30,000 a year when I had access to hundreds of millions?" Dorothy's expression grew serious. "Because I wanted you to develop your own character, your own sense of purpose. I wanted you to learn the value of work, of earning your own way in the world. And most importantly, I wanted you to find someone who loved you for yourself, not for your money." "Well, that backfired spectacularly," Vivian said bitterly. "Richard doesn't love me at all." "No, but at least you learned that before you gave him access to your real wealth," Dorothy pointed out. "Imagine if he'd known about the money from the beginning. He would have married you for your fortune and then spent the rest of your marriage trying to control it. This way, you discovered his true character before any real damage was done. Vivian looked down at her swollen belly. Except for the small matter of carrying his child. That's not damage, darling. That's the greatest gift you'll ever receive. And now you have the financial independence to raise your daughter exactly as you choose, without having to compromise or depend on a man who's proven himself unworthy of your trust. Dorothy reached over and took Vivian's hand. I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to understand something important. You are not a victim here. You are a powerful woman who temporarily forgot her own worth. It's time to remember who you really are. For the first time since Richard's devastating announcement, Vivian felt a spark of hope. She wasn't just a discarded wife begging for scraps from her millionaire ex-husband's table. She was Dorothy Montgomery's granddaughter, heir to a diamond empire, with more wealth and power than Richard had ever dreamed of possessing. What do I do now? She asked. Dorothy's smile was both warm and slightly predatory. Now, my dear, we teach your ex-husband and his little gold digger exactly what happens when they underestimate a Montgomery woman. The next morning, Dorothy led Vivian through a door she'd never noticed before, hidden behind a bookshelf in her grandmother's study. What Vivian had always assumed was just another wall opened to reveal a narrow staircase leading downward. Where are we going? Vivian asked, her hand trailing along the stone walls as they descended. To the heart of our family's operation, Dorothy replied, her voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. Your great-grandfather was a practical man who believed in keeping important things close to home. The stairs ended at a heavy oak door with an electronic lock system that looked surprisingly modern given the old-world atmosphere above. Dorothy pressed her palm to a scanner, and the door swung open silently. Vivian gasped. Beyond the door lay a sophisticated office complex that seemed to exist in a different century from the colonial house above. Sleek computer monitors lined modern desks, secure phone systems blinked with incoming calls, and multiple screens displayed what appeared to be real-time mining operations from around the world. Welcome to Montgomery Diamond Enterprises headquarters, Dorothy said with obvious pride. We've been operating from this location for 40 years, managing our global operations while maintaining complete privacy from the outside world. A distinguished man in his mid-50s approached them, wearing an impeccably tailored suit despite being underground. Miss Montgomery, he said with a slight British accent, I've prepared the briefing materials you requested. Vivian, this is Clayton Whitmore, our family attorney and business manager. Clayton, this is my granddaughter, whom I believe you've been preparing files for. Clayton extended his hand with a warm smile. Ms. Vivian, it's my absolute pleasure to finally meet you properly. I've been managing your trust fund since you were 16, though you weren't aware of it at the time. You've been managing my money for 13 years. Among other responsibilities, Clayton replied diplomatically, your grandmother believed in allowing you to develop independently while ensuring your inheritance was properly protected and growing. Dorothy gestured for them to sit at a conference table surrounded by monitors showing mining operations from what appeared to be locations across Africa, Australia, and Canada. I want Vivian to understand the full scope of what she's inheriting, Dorothy said. Not just the money, but the responsibility and the power. Clayton activated a presentation on the main screen. Montgomery Diamond Enterprises currently operates 7 major mining facilities across 3 continents. He began. We employ over 3,000 people worldwide and produce approximately 12% of the world's high-quality diamonds. Images flashed across the screen, showing vast open-pit mines, sophisticated processing facilities, and workers operating massive machinery. Vivian had never imagined that her quiet grandmother was overseeing such a massive operation. But what makes us unique, Clayton continued, is our business model. Rather than selling under our own brand, we supply diamonds to the world's most prestigious jewelry houses. Tiffany, Cartier, Harry Winston, they all use Montgomery diamonds in their most expensive pieces, though the public doesn't know it. Why the secrecy? Vivian asked. Control and influence, Dorothy replied. When people don't know you're the source of their most precious commodities, they can't pressure you or try to manipulate your operations. We set our own terms, maintain our own standards, and operate according to our own values. Clayton pulled up another screen showing financial projections. The discretion also allows us to reinvest profits without public scrutiny. While other diamond companies worry about stock prices and quarterly reports, we can make long-term investments that benefit our workers and communities. Speaking of which, Dorothy said, show her the ethical operations report. The screen filled with images of schools, medical clinics, and clean water systems. Unlike many mining operations, Montgomery Diamond Enterprises has always prioritized the well-being of our workers and their communities. Clayton explained, we build schools, provide health care, and ensure that a significant portion of our profits stays in the regions where we operate. Vivian felt overwhelmed by the scope of what she was seeing. This is incredible, but I don't understand anything about running a business this size. You don't need to understand everything immediately, Dorothy said gently. You have excellent advisors, well-established systems, and most importantly, you have time to learn. But what I want you to understand right now is the power you possess. She nodded to Clayton, who pulled up a new presentation. This brings us to current events, he said with a slight smile. Your soon-to-be ex-husband has been making inquiries about diamond suppliers for his new venture. The screen showed email correspondence between Richard's business manager and several diamond suppliers, including Montgomery's intermediary companies. He's planning to launch a luxury jewelry line with his mistress as the face of the brand. Dorothy explained, she'll model the pieces, he'll handle the business side, and they'll market themselves as the glamorous couple behind the jewelry. The irony, Clayton added, is that he's specifically been requesting the highest quality diamonds available, the kind that only we can consistently supply in the quantities he would need for a major launch. Vivian studied the emails, noting the increasingly urgent tone as Richard's representatives tried to secure suppliers. He really doesn't know this is our company. He has no idea, Dorothy confirmed. To him, we're just another supplier in a complex chain of middlemen and distributors, but we know exactly who he is and what he's planning. Clayton pulled up another file. We've also been monitoring his financial situation. His requests for diamond supplies are quite ambitious given his actual resources. He's planning to launch with a significant debt load, betting everything on the success of this venture. Which brings us to opportunity, Dorothy said, her eyes gleaming with strategic thinking. Your Richard thinks he's dealing with various separate suppliers and creditors. He doesn't realize he's actually negotiating with the future mother of his child. Vivian felt a thrill of understanding. We could control his entire supply chain. More than that, Clayton said, pulling up yet another screen. We've been quietly purchasing his outstanding debts through various shell companies. Nothing illegal or unethical, simply buying loans that banks are eager to sell. Currently, Montgomery Enterprises holds approximately 60% of your ex-husband's business debt. The numbers on the screen made Vivian's head spin. Richard owed millions of dollars across various loans and credit facilities, and her family's company now owned most of those debts. What does that mean exactly? She asked. It means we could call in those loans at any time, Dorothy explained. Force him into bankruptcy if we chose to, but I think we can be more creative than that. She stood and walked to a secure cabinet, pulling out another file. What I'm about to show you is highly confidential, but I believe you need to understand the full picture. The file contained photographs and financial documents related to Amber's background. Unlike the glamorous image she projected, the reality was quite different. Your Richard's mistress comes from a working-class family in Ohio, Dorothy said. She came to New York 5 years ago with dreams of becoming an actress, but ended up working in high-end bars to pay rent. She's accumulated significant debt of her own trying to maintain the lifestyle necessary to attract wealthy men. For her, she's a professional gold digger. More accurately, she's a desperate young woman who's bet everything on landing a wealthy husband, Clayton corrected diplomatically. She spent money she doesn't have on clothes, jewelry, and cosmetic procedures, all in service of attracting someone like Richard. Dorothy flipped through more documents. The jewelry she was wearing when she confronted you, all purchased on credit cards that are now severely overextended. The designer clothes, the expensive handbag, she's in debt up to her perfectly sculpted eyebrows. So she needs Richard as much as he thinks he needs her. More, Dorothy said with satisfaction, because unlike Richard, who has assets he could liquidate in a crisis, Amber has nothing but debt and a rapidly expiring commodity, her youth and beauty. Vivian felt pieces of a plan beginning to form in her mind. So if something were to happen to Richard's financial situation, Amber would abandon him faster than he abandoned you, Dorothy finished. Gold diggers are remarkably practical creatures. They'll only stay with a man as long as he can maintain their desired lifestyle. Clayton smiled. Which brings us to strategy. We have multiple options for how to proceed, ranging from completely destroying Richard's business to simply making his life more difficult while protecting your interests. What would you recommend? Vivian asked. Dorothy and Clayton exchanged a look. We think the most satisfying approach would be to let Richard dig his own grave, Dorothy said. Continue to let him pursue his business venture while we control every aspect of his supply chain and financing. Let him build his dreams of a new life with his mistress. Then reveal the truth at the moment when he's most invested in his fantasy. The moment when he has the most to lose, Vivian murmured, understanding the elegant cruelty of the plan. Exactly. And meanwhile, you'll be building your own new life, learning to run this business, preparing for your daughter's arrival, and discovering what it means to be a truly independent woman. Vivian looked around the sophisticated operation her grandmother had built and maintained in secret for decades. This was real power, not the flashy, debt-fueled lifestyle Richard had been living, but solid, generational wealth combined with strategic thinking and patience. When do we start? She asked. Dorothy's smile was both warm and fierce. We already have, darling. Now let's teach your millionaire ex-husband what happens when he underestimates a Montgomery woman. 3 days later, Clayton Whitmore arrived at Dorothy's estate with a team of advisors and what appeared to be a small army of documents. Vivian, now more rested and clear-headed after several nights of proper sleep, felt ready to understand the full scope of what they were planning. Before we discuss strategy, Clayton said, settling into the conference room they'd set up in Dorothy's study, I need you to understand the legal and ethical boundaries of what we can and cannot do. Nadine Fletcher, the private investigator Dorothy had hired, placed a thick file on the table. At 38, Nadine had the sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen the worst of human nature, but maintained her integrity. Everything we've gathered on Richard and Amber has been obtained through legal means, Nadine said. Public records, credit reports he's authorized for business purposes, information from associates who volunteered it willingly. We haven't broken any laws or invaded anyone's privacy. The same applies to our business operations, Clayton added, purchasing his debts, controlling his supply chain, even monitoring his business communications through legal channels. It's all completely above board. We're simply using the tools available to any sophisticated business operation. Dorothy nodded approvingly. The Montgomery family has always operated with integrity. We're not interested in destroying Richard out of petty revenge. We're interested in protecting Vivian and ensuring he faces the consequences of his own poor decisions. Nadine opened her file and pulled out a series of photographs and documents. Let's start with what Richard's been up to since he left you. He's moved into a luxury hotel suite while looking for a suitable penthouse for himself and Amber. He's spending approximately $20,000 a week on hotels, restaurants, gifts, and entertainment. $20,000 a week. Vivian couldn't hide her shock. He's trying to maintain a certain image, Clayton explained, both for Amber and for potential investors in his jewelry venture. But here's the problem. His actual liquid assets can't sustain this level of spending for more than a few months. Nadine flipped to another page. He's also been meeting with luxury jewelry designers, marketing consultants, and PR firms. He's planning a major launch event for his new brand, with Amber as the face of the company. The preliminary estimates we've seen suggest he's planning to spend at least $2 million on the launch alone. Money he doesn't actually have, Dorothy observed. Exactly. He's counting on securing diamond suppliers and additional financing. But both of those things are now under our control. Clayton spread out a series of financial projections on the table. Here's what's fascinating about Richard's business plan. It's actually not terrible from a strategic standpoint. There is a market for luxury jewelry marketed by beautiful couples. The problem is that he's dramatically underestimated the capital requirements and overestimated his own resources. So his plan could work if he had proper financing. It could work if he had hundreds of millions in backing and a 5-year timeline, Clayton replied, but he's trying to launch with minimal capital and expecting immediate returns. It's a recipe for disaster. Nadine pulled out another file. This brings us to Amber's situation. She's been pressuring Richard to move faster on both the business launch and their personal relationship. She wants a ring, a wedding date, and immediate access to what she thinks is his wealth. She doesn't know about his financial problems. She has no idea. Richard's been very good at maintaining the illusion of unlimited resources. But our sources suggest she's starting to ask questions about why they're living in a hotel instead of the penthouse he promised her. Dorothy smiled with grim satisfaction. Gold diggers become very nervous when their target starts showing signs of financial stress. They have finely tuned instincts for detecting weakness. Clayton pulled up a presentation on his tablet. This brings us to our strategy. We have several options, ranging from immediate action to a longer-term approach. Let me walk you through the possibilities. The first option appeared on the screen. Option 1, immediate financial pressure. We call in Richard's debts immediately, cut off his access to diamond suppliers, and force him into bankruptcy within 30 days. This would end his relationship with Amber quickly, but might also create a public scandal that could affect you and the baby. Option 2, gradual squeeze. We slowly tighten the financial pressure over 3 to 6 months, allowing Richard to dig himself deeper into trouble while maintaining the illusion that his problems are caused by market conditions or bad luck. This gives us more control over the timeline, but requires more patience. Option 3, the revelation strategy. We allow Richard to proceed with his business plans while controlling all his key resources, then reveal the truth at a moment of maximum impact, perhaps when he's about to launch his business or when Amber's expecting a marriage proposal. Vivian considered the options carefully. What would you recommend? I favor option 3, Dorothy said immediately. It's the most educational for both Richard and his mistress. They'll learn exactly what it feels like to have their dreams destroyed by someone they underestimated. Nadine nodded. From an investigative standpoint, option 3 also gives us the most information. We can monitor their relationship dynamics, see how they handle stress, and potentially gather evidence that could be useful in custody arrangements later. What about the baby? Vivian asked, her hand moving instinctively to her stomach. I don't want her born into the middle of a war zone. Clayton consulted his calendar. Based on your due date, we could time the revelation for approximately 6 weeks after the birth. That gives you time to recover, establish routines with the baby, and prepare for whatever Richard's reaction might be. Plus, Dorothy added, by then you'll have had time to learn more about running Montgomery Diamond Enterprises. You'll be approaching this from a position of confidence and competence, not just as a woman seeking revenge. Vivian felt the truth of that statement. Even in the few days since learning about her inheritance, she'd started to feel different, stronger, more purposeful. The idea of spending the next few months learning to run a global business while preparing for motherhood was actually exciting. There's one more element to consider, Nadine said, pulling out a final folder. Amber's debt situation is actually more precarious than Richard's. Her credit cards are maxed out. She owes back rent on an apartment she can't afford. And she's borrowed money from family members who are starting to ask questions. Meaning she's under enormous financial pressure to secure her future with Richard quickly. If we create any doubt about his ability to take care of her, she might abandon him even before we reveal the truth about your family's wealth. Dorothy leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. So we could potentially break them up without revealing anything about our involvement. It's possible, Nadine confirmed. Gold diggers are practical creatures. If Richard starts seeming like a liability instead of an asset, Amber will cut her losses and move on to the next target. Clayton cleared his throat. Before we proceed with any strategy, I need to address one more issue. Vivian, what do you want the end result to be? Are you hoping for reconciliation with Richard? Do you want him to be a part of your daughter's life? Or are you primarily interested in ensuring he can't hurt you financially? It was a question Vivian had been avoiding, but she knew she needed to face it honestly. I don't want him back, she said firmly. Not after seeing who he really is. But I do want our daughter to have the option of knowing her father if she chooses to when she's older. And I want him to understand that abandoning his family has consequences. Then I think option 3 is perfect, Dorothy said with satisfaction. We teach him a lesson about consequences while maintaining enough control to protect your daughter's interests long term. Vivian looked around the table at these people who were dedicating their considerable skills to protecting her and her unborn child. For the first time since Richard's cruel announcement, she felt truly safe. "Let's do it," she said. "But I want to be involved in every step. I want to learn how to protect myself and my daughter, not just have other people do it for me." Dorothy's smile was radiant with pride. "Now you're thinking like a Montgomery woman." 2 weeks later, Vivian stood before the mirror in her childhood bedroom at Dorothy's estate, adjusting the drape of an elegant maternity dress. Tonight was the Metropolitan Museum's annual gala, an event she'd attended for years as a curator and later as Richard's wife. This year, she was attending as herself, Vivian Montgomery, granddaughter of one of America's wealthiest families. "The necklace is perfect," Dorothy said, fastening a stunning diamond piece around Vivian's neck. $2 million worth of Montgomery diamonds. "Let's see how your ex-husband reacts to that." The necklace was a masterpiece of design and craftsmanship, featuring rare pink diamonds in an intricate floral pattern. It was the kind of jewelry that appeared in museum exhibitions and private collections, not on the neck of a woman Richard considered financially dependent on his generosity. "Are you sure he'll be there?" Vivian asked, smoothing her hands over the fitted bodice of her dress. At 8.5 months pregnant, she felt enormous, but the custom designer maternity gown made her feel elegant rather than unwieldy. "Clayton confirmed it this afternoon," Dorothy replied. "He bought a table for 10 at $50,000, presumably to impress potential investors in his jewelry venture. And according to our sources, Amber will be wearing the necklace he bought her, the one you saw at the bar." Nadine appeared in the doorway, looking sophisticated in her own evening gown. "The car is ready, and I've confirmed that our photographer will be positioned to capture reactions. Richard won't know he's being photographed, but we'll have a complete record of the evening." "Remember," Dorothy said, taking Vivian's hands, "you're not going there as Richard's abandoned wife seeking sympathy. You're going as a Montgomery, claiming your rightful place in society. Walk into that room like you own it." "Because in many ways you do," Clayton added, joining them in the foyer. "Montgomery Diamond Enterprises has been a major contributor to the Met for decades. You're not crashing their party, you're attending your own family's event." The ride into Manhattan gave Vivian time to center herself. Through the limousine's windows, she watched the familiar streets of her childhood, remembering the excited little girl who used to visit the museum with her grandmother, never suspecting that her family's diamonds adorned many of the jewelry pieces in the permanent collection. The Metropolitan Museum at night was transformed into a glittering wonderland. Guests in designer gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos climbed the famous steps, their jewelry catching the light from hundreds of cameras. Vivian took a deep breath and stepped out of the limousine, immediately conscious of the weight of the diamond necklace and the stares of other guests. "Ms. Montgomery," a photographer called out, recognizing her from previous years. "You look absolutely radiant. Is it true you're expecting—" "Yes, my daughter is due very soon," Vivian replied with a genuine smile. "I couldn't miss this event. The Met has always been like a second home to me." Inside the museum, the cocktail reception was in full swing. Vivian accepted a glass of sparkling water and began moving through the crowd, greeting friends and colleagues she hadn't seen since leaving her job. The reactions were uniformly positive. People seemed genuinely happy to see her and eager to congratulate her on her pregnancy. "Vivian, my God, you look incredible," exclaimed Sarah Wellington. "A prominent art dealer? That necklace is absolutely stunning. I don't think I've ever seen pink diamonds of that quality." "Thank you," Vivian replied graciously. "It's been in my family for years. I thought tonight was the perfect occasion to wear it." As she moved through the room, Vivian became aware of a subtle shift in the energy around her. People were looking at her differently than they had in previous years, with a kind of respect and deference she'd never experienced before. The diamond necklace was sending a clear message about her status and resources. Then she saw him. Richard stood near the bar, resplendent in a custom tuxedo, holding court with a small group of potential investors. Amber was at his side, wearing the $50,000 diamond necklace Vivian had seen at the jewelry store receipt. She looked beautiful in a form-fitting red dress, but her jewelry paled in comparison to what Vivian was wearing. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. Richard's expression shifted from surprise to confusion to something approaching alarm as he took in Vivian's appearance. She looked nothing like the defeated, pregnant woman he'd abandoned 2 weeks ago. Instead, she looked like exactly what she was, one of the wealthiest women in the room. Amber noticed Richard's distraction and followed his gaze. When she saw Vivian, her face went pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. The confidence she'd displayed at their previous encounter evaporated as she took in the obvious signs of Vivian's elevated status. "Ladies and gentlemen," the museum director announced from the podium, "we're honored to have so many generous supporters with us tonight. I'd like to particularly acknowledge the Montgomery family, whose ongoing support has been instrumental in expanding our jewelry and decorative arts collection." A spotlight found Vivian in the crowd, and she smiled graciously as applause filled the room. She could see Richard's face clearly now, and his expression was one of complete bewilderment. He was trying to process how his supposedly dependent ex-wife had suddenly become someone worthy of special recognition. "Miss Montgomery," the director continued, "would you like to say a few words about your family's commitment to the arts?" Vivian felt every eye in the room turn to her. This was her moment to step fully into her new identity. She walked gracefully to the podium, her hand resting protectively on her belly. "Thank you so much," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "The Montgomery family has always believed that art and beauty should be accessible to everyone, not hoarded by the wealthy few. That's why I'm delighted to announce tonight that we're making a $10 million donation to establish a new wing dedicated to contemporary jewelry design." The applause was thunderous. $10 million was a significant donation, even by Met standards, and it positioned Vivian as one of the museum's most important benefactors. As she returned to the crowd, people surged forward to congratulate her and express their thanks. Museum board members who had barely acknowledged her existence in previous years now treated her like visiting royalty. The transformation was both exhilarating and slightly overwhelming. "Vivian." A familiar voice made her turn. Richard had worked his way through the crowd, leaving Amber behind at the bar. Up close, he looked even more confused and slightly desperate. "Hello, Richard," she said calmly. "You look well. I hope you're enjoying the evening." Yes, it's a lovely event," he stammered, clearly struggling to reconcile this confident, wealthy woman with the wife he'd so casually discarded. "That's quite a generous donation you just announced." "My family believes in supporting the arts," Vivian replied. "It's something we've done for generations." "Your family?" Richard's voice rose slightly. "Vivian, what's going on? Where did you get that necklace? How can you afford to donate $10 million? Around them, conversations had quieted as people sensed drama unfolding. Vivian smiled serenely, enjoying Richard's obvious discomfort. "I think you may have misunderstood my financial situation, Richard. But then again, there were a lot of things you misunderstood about our marriage." Before Richard could respond, Amber appeared at his side, her arm possessively linked through his. "Richard, darling, they're about to serve dinner. We should get to our table." She looked at Vivian with barely concealed hostility, but there was also fear in her eyes. The balance of power had shifted dramatically, and Amber was sharp enough to recognize the implications. "Of course," Vivian said graciously. "Please don't let me keep you. I hope you both have a wonderful evening." As Richard and Amber walked away, Vivian could see them having an intense whispered conversation. Amber was clearly demanding answers that Richard couldn't provide, and the stress was visible in both their faces. "That went perfectly," Dorothy murmured, appearing at Vivian's side. "Did you see how quickly that little gold digger's attitude changed when she realized you might be wealthier than Richard?" "She looked scared," Vivian observed. "She should be. Her entire strategy depends on Richard being the wealthy one in your relationship. If that's not true, then she's backed the wrong horse." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations and strategic conversations. Vivian found herself genuinely enjoying the social aspects of wealth and influence. When used responsibly, money wasn't just about personal comfort. It was about the ability to make positive changes in the world. As she prepared to leave, Vivian caught one last glimpse of Richard and Amber at their table. They weren't touching, barely speaking, and both looked miserable despite being surrounded by people Richard was trying to impress. "Mission accomplished," Nadine said quietly as they waited for the car. "According to our photographer, Amber spent most of dinner interrogating Richard about your family and your money. She's clearly spooked. Good, Dorothy said with satisfaction. Let them both spend the next few weeks wondering what else they don't know about the Montgomery family. By the time we're ready to reveal the full truth, they'll already be off balance. As the limousine pulled away from the Met, Vivian felt a deep sense of satisfaction. For the first time since Richard's cruel announcement, she felt like herself again, not a victim, but a powerful woman who was just beginning to understand what she was capable of achieving. 3 days after the Met Gala, Vivian was reviewing mining reports in Dorothy's underground office when Clayton announced that Richard had requested an urgent meeting. The news didn't surprise her. Since the gala, Richard had been calling and texting constantly, demanding explanations about her family's wealth and her $10 million donation. Where does he want to meet? Dorothy asked, looking up from her own stack of financial documents. He specifically asked to come here, Clayton replied with a slight smile. He says he wants to discuss clarifying certain misunderstandings about the divorce settlement. How presumptuous, Dorothy observed. He thinks he can march into our home and demand answers after the way he treated you. Vivian considered her options. Part of her wanted to refuse the meeting entirely, but a larger part was curious to see Richard's reaction when he learned the full truth about her family's wealth and power. Let him come, she decided. But we meet in the main house, not down here. He doesn't get to see our business operations. Are you sure you're ready for this confrontation? Clayton asked with concern. You're due to give birth any day now. The stress might not be good for you or the baby. Vivian's hand moved to her belly, where her daughter had been particularly active lately. I think it's important for her to witness this, she said with a slight smile. She should understand from the beginning that Montgomery women don't back down from bullies. An hour later, Richard's familiar BMW pulled through the estate gates. Vivian watched from the living room window as he parked and walked toward the house, his posture radiating the kind of confidence that had once attracted her, but now seemed merely arrogant. Dorothy had arranged for tea to be served in the formal living room, creating an atmosphere of civilized discussion rather than confrontation. Clayton sat in a wingback chair with a briefcase full of documents, while Nadine positioned herself discreetly near the window with a clear view of the proceedings. When Richard entered the room, he moved with the entitled swagger of a man accustomed to getting his way. He dressed carefully for the occasion in an expensive suit that Vivian now realized he probably couldn't afford, and his smile had the practiced charm he used on potential investors. Vivian, you look lovely, he said, as if he hadn't cruelly abandoned her 3 weeks ago. Pregnancy definitely agrees with you. Thank you, she replied coolly, not rising from her chair. Please, have a seat. I understand you wanted to discuss something urgent. Richard settled onto the sofa across from her, his eyes taking in the elegant surroundings with obvious calculation. This is quite a place your grandmother has here. I never realized the extent of her resources. There's a great deal you never realized. Richard, Dorothy said dryly from her own chair. But please, tell us what was so urgent that it couldn't wait for a proper appointment. Richard's smile faltered slightly at Dorothy's tone, but he pressed forward. Well, I think there's been some confusion about our financial arrangements. After seeing Vivian at the Met Gala and learning about her family's generous donation, I realize I may have underestimated certain aspects of the situation. Underestimated how? Vivian asked, though she knew exactly where this was heading. Look, I'll be honest, Richard said, leaning forward with what he probably thought was disarming sincerity. When I asked for the separation, I was under the impression that you would need significant financial support. But clearly, your family has resources I wasn't aware of. Clearly, Dorothy murmured. So I think we need to revisit our discussion about the divorce settlement, Richard continued. Given the new information about your family's wealth, I think it would be fair to reconsider the terms we discussed. Vivian felt a surge of anger so intense it made her dizzy. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. 3 weeks ago, you told me I was boring, embarrassing, and had let myself go. You moved in with your mistress and told me to pack my bags, but now that you think my family has money, you want to reconsider. That's not exactly how I would characterize it, Richard said, his lawyer instincts kicking in. I think we were both emotional during that conversation. Perhaps we move too quickly toward separation without fully exploring our options. Our options? Vivian's voice rose dangerously. Richard, you told me you were done pretending our marriage meant anything to you. You said you'd found someone who appreciated what you could offer. What exactly has changed besides your perception of my financial situation? Richard shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing the trap but unable to avoid it. Look, couples go through rough patches. The important thing is that we're both mature enough to work through our differences. And what about Amber? Dorothy asked sweetly. I believe you've been living with her for the past 3 weeks. How does she feel about this sudden change of heart? For the first time, Richard looked genuinely uncomfortable. Amber understands that my daughter's welfare has to come first. She's very supportive of me doing the right thing for my family. How remarkably understanding of her, Vivian said. Especially considering she told me that you'd promised to handle the baby situation so you could start fresh together. Richard's face flushed. I never said that. Are you calling me a liar? Richard, I'm saying that sometimes people misinterpret things when emotions are running high. Clayton cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps this would be a good time to review the actual facts of the situation. Mr. Blackwood, I believe you've been operating under some significant misapprehensions about both your own financial position and Ms. Montgomery's family circumstances. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Let's start with your business situation. Are you aware that Montgomery Diamond Enterprises has been monitoring your attempts to secure diamond suppliers for your new jewelry venture? Richard's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion. Montgomery Diamond Enterprises, I've never heard of that company. Oh, but you have, Dorothy said with a cold smile. You've been trying to buy diamonds from us for weeks. We control the supply chain for most of the high-quality stones you've been requesting. That's impossible. I've been dealing with established suppliers, companies with decades of experience. Companies that source their diamonds from us, Clayton explained patiently. Montgomery Diamond Enterprises has been the hidden power behind the luxury diamond trade for over 70 years. We prefer to operate discreetly, but we control approximately 12% of the world's high-quality diamond production. Richard's face had gone pale. You're saying Vivian's family owns a diamond mining company? Not just any diamond mining company, Dorothy said with obvious satisfaction. We're one of the largest privately held diamond operations in the world. Tiffany, Cartier, Harry Winston. They all use our stones in their most expensive pieces. Clayton pulled out another document. Which brings us to your financial situation. Mr. Blackwood, are you aware that Montgomery Enterprises now holds approximately 60% of your outstanding business debt? What are you talking about? We've been quietly purchasing your loans from various banks and lending institutions, Clayton explained. Nothing illegal, simply taking advantage of opportunities when banks wanted to offload risky debt. Currently, we own most of your company's financial obligations. Richard stood up abruptly, his composure finally cracking. This is insane. You're telling me that Vivian's family has been manipulating my business dealings. We're telling you that your business dealings have been incredibly sloppy, Dorothy corrected. Any competent financial advisor would have warned you about taking on so much debt without diversifying your creditor base. But why would you? Richard began, then stopped as the full implications hit him. You've been planning this. Ever since I asked for the divorce, you've been planning to destroy my business. We've been protecting our family's interests, Vivian said firmly, which includes protecting my daughter from a father who thinks he can abandon his responsibilities without consequences. Richard turned to face her, his expression desperate. Vivian, you have to understand, I never knew about your family's wealth. If I had known, things would have been different. Different how? She asked coldly. You would have stayed married to the boring, embarrassing woman who let herself go. You would have continued pretending our marriage meant something to you. That's not fair. If I had known you were wealthy, I would have understood that you had other options, other interests. I wouldn't have expected you to be content with just being a housewife. So my value as a wife was dependent on my net worth. Richard realized he was digging himself deeper, but couldn't seem to stop. That's not what I meant. I meant that wealthy women have different expectations, different needs. I would have adjusted my behavior accordingly. You mean you would have treated me with respect if you'd known I could afford to leave you? Vivian said flatly. Look, I made mistakes, Richard admitted, his voice taking on the pleading tone she'd never heard before. I was going through a difficult time, feeling trapped by responsibilities I wasn't ready for. But I never stopped loving you. You have a funny way of showing love, Dorothy observed. Moving in with your mistress, humiliating my granddaughter in public, planning to abandon your unborn child. I wasn't abandoning anyone I promised to pay child support, to be involved in the baby's life. On your terms, when it was convenient for you, Vivian said. Just like this conversation. You only want to reconcile now that you think there's money involved? Clayton consulted his notes. Speaking of money, Mr. Blackwood, perhaps you'd like to know the exact amount of your debt that we now control. The total is approximately $12 million across various loans and credit facilities. Richard sank back onto the sofa, the number hitting him like a physical blow. 12 million, that can't be right. I'm afraid it is. And under the terms of those loans, we have the right to call them in at any time if we determine that the debtor's financial situation has become unstable. You're threatening to bankrupt me. We're informing you of the reality of your situation, Dorothy said calmly. Your business is already in serious trouble. Richard, the lavish lifestyle you've been maintaining, the expensive gifts for your mistress, the ambitious launch plans for your jewelry venture, none of it is sustainable with your actual resources. For over 70 years, we prefer to operate discreetly, but we control approximately 12% of the world's high-quality diamond production. Avery, Richard's face had gone pale. You're saying Vivian's family owns a diamond mining company? Not just any diamond mining company, Dorothy said with obvious satisfaction. We're one of the largest privately held diamond operations in the world. Tiffany, Cartier, Harry Winston, they all use our stones in their most expensive pieces. Clayton pulled out another document. Which brings us to your financial situation, Mr. Blackwood. Are you aware that Montgomery Enterprises now holds approximately 60% of your outstanding business debt? What are you talking about? We've been quietly purchasing your loans from various banks and lending institutions, Clayton explained. Nothing illegal, simply taking advantage of opportunities when banks wanted to offload risky debt. Currently, we own most of your company's financial obligations. Richard stood up abruptly, his composure finally cracking. This is insane. You're telling me that Vivian's family has been manipulating my business dealings? We're telling you that your business dealings have been incredibly sloppy, Dorothy corrected. Any competent financial advisor would have warned you about taking on so much debt without diversifying your creditor base. But why would you? Richard began, then stopped as the full implications hit him. You've been planning this. Ever since I asked for the divorce, you've been planning to destroy my business. We've been protecting our family's interests, Vivian said firmly, which includes protecting my daughter from a father who thinks he can abandon his responsibilities without consequences. Richard turned to face her, his expression desperate. Vivian, you have to understand, I never knew about your family's wealth. If I had known, things would have been different. Different how? She asked coldly. You would have stayed married to the boring, embarrassing woman who let herself go. You would have continued pretending our marriage meant something to you. That's not fair. If I had known you were wealthy, I would have understood that you had other options, other interests. I wouldn't have expected you to be content with just being a housewife. So my value as a wife was dependent on my net worth. Richard realized he was digging himself deeper but couldn't seem to stop. That's not what I meant. I meant that wealthy women have different expectations, different needs. I would have adjusted my behavior accordingly. You mean you would have treated me with respect if you'd known I could afford to leave you? Vivian said flatly. Look, I made mistakes, Richard admitted, his voice taking on the pleading tone she'd never heard before. I was going through a difficult time, feeling trapped by responsibilities I wasn't ready for. But I never stopped loving you. You have a funny way of showing love, Dorothy observed. Moving in with your mistress, humiliating my granddaughter in public, planning to abandon your unborn child. I wasn't abandoning anyone I promised to pay child support, to be involved in the baby's life. On your terms, when it was convenient for you, Vivian said. Just like this conversation, You only want to reconcile now that you think there's money involved. Clayton consulted his notes. Speaking of money, Mr. Blackwood, perhaps you'd like to know the exact amount of your debt that we now control. The total is approximately $12 million across various loans and credit facilities. Richard sank back onto the sofa, the number hitting him like a physical blow. 12 million. That can't be right. I'm afraid it is. And under the terms of those loans, we have the right to call them in at any time if we determine that the debtor's financial situation has become unstable. You're threatening to bankrupt me. We're informing you of the reality of your situation, Dorothy said calmly. Your business is already in serious trouble. Richard, the lavish lifestyle you've been maintaining, the expensive gifts for your mistress, the ambitious launch plans for your jewelry venture, none of it is sustainable with your actual resources. Richard looked around the room desperately, as if seeking an escape route. What do you want from me? Money I'll pay back every penny, with interest. What we want, Vivian said, struggling to stand as another contraction gripped her abdomen, is for you to understand that actions have consequences. You can't treat people as disposable and expect them to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you decide to throw their way. Dorothy noticed Vivian's discomfort immediately. Darling, are you all right? I think, Vivian began, then gasped as another, stronger contraction hit. I think the baby is coming. The room erupted in controlled chaos. Clayton immediately called for Dr. Mills while Dorothy helped Vivian back to her chair. Nadine moved toward the door to prepare for the doctor's arrival. Richard, meanwhile, seemed frozen in place, his face cycling through confusion, panic, and what might have been genuine concern. Should I call an ambulance? He asked, his business crisis temporarily forgotten. Dr. Mills is on his way, Dorothy replied curtly. He's been on standby for weeks. I should drive you to the hospital, Richard said, standing up. I'm still your husband. I should be there for the birth. You lost the right to make those decisions when you moved in with your mistress, Dorothy said firmly. This is a family matter now. She's having my daughter. She's having a Montgomery daughter, Dorothy corrected, and she'll be raised to understand her worth, something you clearly never learned to appreciate. Dr. Mills arrived within minutes, his calm professionalism immediately taking charge of the situation. After a quick examination, he determined that while Vivian was indeed in labor, they had time to get her to the hospital safely. As the medical team prepared to transport Vivian, Richard stood helplessly to one side, clearly wanting to be involved but uncertain of his role. Vivian, he said as they prepared to leave, please let me come with you. Whatever our problems, I want to be there when our daughter is born. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time the frightened, flawed man beneath the confident exterior. You can come to the hospital, she said finally, but you need to understand that everything has changed. I'm not the same woman you walked away from 3 weeks ago. I know, Richard said quietly. I'm beginning to realize I never really knew who you were at all. As they left for the hospital, Clayton remained behind to secure the house and the sensitive documents they'd been reviewing. The confrontation wasn't over. It was simply interrupted by the arrival of the next generation of Montgomery women. This should be interesting, Dorothy murmured to Clayton as the ambulance pulled away. Nothing quite like the birth of a child to clarify people's priorities. The private birthing suite at Mount Sinai Hospital was a far cry from the modest room Vivian had originally planned to use. Dorothy had quietly arranged for the upgrade, ensuring her great-granddaughter would be born in comfort and privacy, away from any potential media attention that might result from the evening's revelations. Vivian gripped the bed rails as another contraction peaked, breathing through the pain with the focused determination she'd learned in childbirth classes. Richard sat in a chair by the window, looking completely out of place in his expensive suit among the medical equipment and soft lighting. How are you feeling, Doctor? Mills asked, checking Vivian's progress. At 52, Harold Mills had delivered hundreds of babies, but he treated each birth with the careful attention that had made him one of New York's most sought-after obstetricians. Like I'm about to meet my daughter, Vivian replied, managing a smile despite the discomfort. The contractions were getting stronger and closer together, but she felt surprisingly calm. Perhaps it was the clarity that had come from finally understanding her own power and worth. Your progress is excellent, Dr. Mills confirmed. I'd estimate we'll have a baby within the next few hours. Dorothy sat in the corner, quietly knitting what appeared to be a tiny blanket. She'd been through this process twice with her own children and had developed the serene patience that came with experience. Occasionally, she glanced at Richard with an expression that suggested she was taking his measure and finding him wanting. Vivian, Richard said during a lull between contractions, I need you to know that seeing you tonight, learning about your family, it's made me realize how much I misunderstood about our relationship. This isn't the time for that conversation, Dorothy said firmly without looking up from her knitting. When will be the time? Richard asked, frustration creeping into his voice. After you've destroyed my business, after you've made sure I can never rebuild my life. After you've proven that you understand what you threw away, Vivian said, her voice strained but determined. You can't just apologize your way back into my life because you've discovered I'm wealthy. Another contraction hit, stronger than before, and Richard instinctively moved closer to the bed. Is there anything I can do? You can be quiet and let me focus, Vivian replied, not unkindly but with clear boundaries. As the hours passed, the dynamics in the room shifted subtly. Richard's earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by genuine anxiety about the birth and growing awareness of how thoroughly he'd misjudged the situation. He watched Vivian handle each contraction with grace and strength, seeing qualities in her that he'd somehow overlooked during their marriage. I keep thinking about when we first met, he said quietly during one of the calmer moments. You were so passionate about that Monet sketch at the auction. You explained how the preliminary work revealed the artist's true vision, better than the finished painting. I remember, Vivian said, surprised he'd retained that detail. I thought I understood what you meant then, but I didn't really. I was too focused on the finished product, the polished result. I never appreciated the depth of what was underneath. Dorothy finally looked up from her knitting, her expression thoughtful. That's a remarkably insightful observation. Richard, the question is whether it represents genuine understanding or simply desperation. Maybe both, Richard admitted, but I know I don't deserve forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable. I abandoned my pregnant wife for a younger woman who made me feel important. I was selfish and cruel, and I justified it by telling myself that Vivian would be better off without me. You told yourself she'd be better off without you. Dorothy's voice was sharp with disbelief. Or you told yourself she had no choice but to accept whatever scraps of support you decided to offer. Richard was quiet for a long moment. The second one, he said finally. I assumed she was financially dependent on me, so she'd have to accept whatever arrangement I proposed. It made it easier to justify leaving. And now that you know she doesn't need your money, now I realize I gave up the best thing in my life for nothing. Vivian felt another strong contraction building and gripped the bedrail. Richard, I need you to understand something, she said between breaths. Even if I forgive you someday, even if we find a way to co-parent our daughter successfully, I will never be that naive woman who trusted you completely again. You killed that version of me when you walked out. I know, he said quietly, and I hate myself for it. Dr. Mills returned to check Vivian's progress and announced that it was time to prepare for delivery. The mood in the room became focused and intense as the medical team prepared for the final stage of labor. I can see the head, Dr. Mills announced. One more strong push should do it. Vivian bore down with everything she had, feeling her daughter moving through the birth canal toward her first breath. The pain was intense but purposeful, and she channeled all her newfound strength into bringing her child safely into the world. She's beautiful, Dr. Mills said as the baby emerged, pink and perfect and crying lustily. A healthy baby girl. The sound of her daughter's first cry filled Vivian with overwhelming emotion. This tiny person was completely hers, a Montgomery woman who would grow up knowing her own worth and power. She would never have to hide who she was or apologize for her strength. Would you like to cut the cord? Dr. Mills asked Richard. Richard looked to Vivian for permission, and she nodded. It seemed important for him to participate in this moment, to understand that becoming a father carried responsibilities he couldn't simply walk away from when they became inconvenient. As Richard carefully cut the umbilical cord, his hands were shaking. When Dr. Mills placed the baby in Vivian's arms, Richard's eyes filled with tears. She's perfect, he whispered. She's absolutely perfect. Yes, she is, Vivian agreed, studying her daughter's tiny features. The baby had Richard's dark hair, but what appeared to be the Montgomery family's distinctive blue eyes. Hello, Dorothy Grace, she murmured. Welcome to the world. Dorothy Grace, Richard asked. Name for her great-grandmother, Vivian explained. The strongest woman I know. Dorothy approached the bed, her own eyes bright with tears. May I hold her? Vivian carefully transferred the baby to her grandmother's experienced arms. Dorothy looked down at her great-granddaughter with an expression of pure love and fierce protectiveness. She's going to be formidable, Dorothy said with satisfaction. I can already tell she has the Montgomery spirit. Richard watched this exchange with growing understanding of how thoroughly he'd been excluded from the family he'd chosen to abandon. This wasn't just about his marriage to Vivian. It was about a multi-generational dynasty that his daughter would inherit, with or without his participation. What happens now? He asked quietly. Now you learn what it really means to be a father, Dorothy replied, still holding the baby. Not the fun parts when it's convenient for you, but the daily commitment to putting someone else's needs before your own. And if I can prove that I understand that, then maybe someday you'll earn the right to be part of Dorothy Grace's life, Vivian said. But that's going to take years. Richard, not weeks. You destroyed 5 years of trust in a single conversation. Rebuilding that will require consistent action, not just pretty words. Dr. Wright Mills completed the delivery procedures and announced that both mother and baby were healthy. As the medical team prepared to move them to a recovery room, Richard made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. I'm going to end things with Amber tonight, he said. Not because I think it will change anything between us, but because it's the right thing to do. I should have done it weeks ago. What about your business plans? Your jewelry venture, Dorothy asked. I think those plans were built on fantasies anyway, Richard admitted. I was trying to create a life that looked successful from the outside instead of building something with real substance. Vivian studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation. Instead, she saw something she'd rarely witnessed in their marriage, genuine humility and what might be the beginning of real self-awareness. The debt we hold doesn't disappear just because you've had an epiphany, she said. I know, and I'll work to pay back every penny, even if it takes the rest of my life. We'll see, Dorothy said diplomatically. Actions matter more than promises. Richard, show us who you really are when no one's watching and you have nothing to gain. As they settled into the recovery room, baby Dorothy sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, Richard sat quietly in the corner. For the first time since his cruel announcement 3 weeks ago, he seemed to understand the magnitude of what he'd lost and the long road ahead if he wanted any chance of redemption. The Montgomery women had a new member, and she would grow up knowing that she was loved, valued, and powerful enough to shape her own destiny. Whether her father would be part of that journey remained to be seen. 6 months later, Vivian stood in the executive conference room of Montgomery Diamond Enterprises, baby Dorothy sleeping peacefully in a high-tech carrier that allowed her to attend meetings without disruption. The room was filled with mining engineers, financial advisors, and regional managers who had flown in from around the world for their quarterly planning session. The South African operation is exceeding production targets by 15%, reported James Morrison, their mining director. The new extraction techniques we implemented are proving both more efficient and more environmentally sustainable. Vivian nodded, making notes on her tablet while keeping one eye on her daughter. In the months since Dorothy's birth, she'd thrown herself into learning the family business with the same intensity she'd once brought to her art history studies. The work was challenging and rewarding in ways she'd never expected. What about the community development projects? She asked. The new school in Botswana opens next month, and the medical clinic in Australia is ahead of schedule, replied Sarah Chen, their community relations director. We're also launching a scholarship program for children of mining families to attend university. This was the kind of impact that made the hard work worthwhile. Montgomery Diamond Enterprises had always been profitable, but under Vivian's influence, it was becoming a force for positive change in the communities where they operated. Excellent work, everyone, Dorothy said from her place at the head of the table. At 67, she was gradually transitioning more responsibilities to Vivian while maintaining oversight of the strategic direction. Vivian, would you like to present the expansion proposal? Vivian stood adjusting baby Dorothy's carrier as she moved to the presentation screen. We've identified an opportunity to acquire a struggling mining operation in Canada. The previous owners mismanaged the resources, but our geological surveys suggest the site has significant untapped potential. She clicked through a series of charts and projections, explaining how they could modernize the operation while providing sustainable employment for the local community. It was exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had made Montgomery Diamond Enterprises successful for generations. The initial investment would be substantial, she continued, but the long-term returns could be exceptional. More importantly, we'd be saving jobs and revitalizing a community that's been devastated by economic decline. The discussion that followed was detailed and thoughtful, touching on environmental concerns, labor relations, and market projections. Vivian found herself energized by the complexity of the decisions they were making and the real-world impact of their choices. After the meeting concluded and the staff had dispersed, Vivian remained in the conference room with Dorothy, feeding baby Dorothy while reviewing the day's decisions. "You've taken to this remarkably well," Dorothy observed. "I wasn't sure how you'd adapt to the business world after spending so many years focused on art and academia." "I think they're more similar than I expected," Vivian replied, adjusting the baby's position. "Both require the ability to see patterns, to understand how individual elements contribute to a larger whole, and both involve preserving something valuable for future generations." "Speaking of future generations," Dorothy said with a slight smile, "there's someone here to see you." Vivian looked up in surprise as Clayton entered the conference room, followed by Richard. She hadn't seen her millionaire ex-husband in several weeks, though they'd been communicating regularly about custody arrangements and his slowly improving financial situation. Richard looked different from the polished businessman who had once dominated their social circle. His suit was well made but not ostentatious, his manner more subdued and genuinely respectful. He'd spent the past 6 months working to rebuild his company from the ground up, taking a more conservative approach to expansion and focusing on sustainable growth rather than flashy acquisitions. "Hello, Vivian," he said quietly. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. Of course, how are things with the new business plan?" "Slow but steady," Richard replied. "I've managed to renegotiate most of my debts on more favorable terms, and the company is finally operating in the black. It's not the empire I once envisioned, but it's honest work that I can be proud of." Baby Dorothy began to fuss, and Richard's expression softened immediately. "May I?" Vivian hesitated for a moment, then carefully transferred their daughter to Richard's arms. He'd been visiting regularly, always respectful of Vivian's boundaries, but clearly desperate to build a relationship with his child. "She's gotten so big," he said wonderfully, studying Dorothy's alert face. "And those eyes, definitely Montgomery blue." "She's going to be formidable," Dorothy said with obvious pride, "just like her mother." Richard looked up at Vivian with an expression she'd never seen before, genuine admiration mixed with profound regret. "I wanted to tell you that I've been following your work with the company, the community development projects, the expansion plans. It's impressive what you've accomplished." "Thank you," Vivian said, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I also wanted you to know that I've been in therapy," Richard continued, his voice carefully measured, "trying to understand why I made the choices I did, why I threw away the best thing in my life for something so shallow." "And what have you learned?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, gently rocking baby Dorothy as he considered his answer. "I learned that I was terrified of real intimacy, real responsibility. It was easier to blame you for being boring than to admit that I was scared of becoming the kind of man who deserved you and our daughter." Dorothy raised an eyebrow but said nothing, allowing the conversation to unfold naturally. "I also learned that my idea of success was completely hollow," Richard continued. "I was so focused on what other people thought, on maintaining an image of wealth and power, that I lost sight of what actually mattered." "And what matters?" Vivian asked. "This," Richard said, looking down at baby Dorothy. "Family, building something meaningful instead of just profitable, being the kind of person my daughter can look up to when she's old enough to make judgments about character." Vivian felt a familiar tug of emotion, but resisted the urge to soften too quickly. Richard's words sounded genuine, but she'd learned to value actions over promises. Those are good realizations. Richard, but what do you want from me? Nothing, he said, surprising her. I mean, I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. I know I destroyed that possibility when I walked out on you. I just wanted you to know that I understand what I lost, and I'm grateful for whatever role you'll allow me to have in Dorothy's life. Baby Dorothy had fallen asleep in Richard's arms, her tiny fist wrapped around his finger. The sight tugged at Vivian's heart despite her determination to maintain emotional distance. I've been thinking about custody arrangements, she said carefully. Dorothy deserves to know her father, but I need to see consistent evidence that you've really changed before I'm comfortable with unsupervised visits. That's fair, Richard replied immediately. More than fair, considering how I behaved. I'm willing to follow whatever timeline you're comfortable with. Clayton cleared his throat diplomatically. There's also the matter of the business debt to discuss. Richard's expression grew more serious. I know Montgomery Enterprises still holds most of my loans. I've been paying according to the schedule we established, and I hope to have everything settled within the next 3 years. Actually, Dorothy said with a slight smile, we have a different proposal. She nodded to Clayton, who pulled out a legal document. We're prepared to forgive the debt entirely, with one condition. Richard looked stunned. What condition? That you establish a trust fund for Dorothy's education and future needs. Clayton explained. The amount you would have paid us over the next 3 years goes instead into a protected account for your daughter. That's incredibly generous, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. But why would you do that? Because holding that debt serves no purpose except punishment, Vivian said, and I'd rather focus on building a positive future for Dorothy than dwelling on past mistakes. Also, Dorothy added pragmatically, it ensures that you have a strong financial incentive to remain committed to your daughter's well-being. Richard looked around the room at these women who had every reason to destroy him, but were instead offering him a path toward redemption. I don't know what to say. Say you'll be the father Dorothy deserves, Vivian replied, consistently, reliably, without drama or excuses. I will, Richard said solemnly. I promise you, I will. As the meeting concluded and Richard prepared to leave, baby Dorothy woke up and looked directly at her father with those piercing Montgomery blue eyes. For a moment, the room was filled with the kind of peace that comes from difficult decisions finally finding their proper resolution. Vivian, Richard said as he handed Dorothy back to her mother, I know I have no right to say this, but I'm proud of the woman you've become. You were always strong and intelligent, but now you know your own power. Dorothy is lucky to have you as a mother. After Richard left, Vivian and Dorothy sat in comfortable silence, watching baby Dorothy explore her surroundings with the fearless curiosity that seemed to characterize Montgomery women. Do you think he's really changed? Vivian asked. I think he's beginning to understand what change requires, Dorothy replied thoughtfully. Whether he can sustain that understanding over time remains to be seen. But you've given him a chance to prove himself, which is more generous than he deserved. Vivian looked out the window at the Manhattan skyline, thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she'd been a discarded wife with no clear sense of her own worth. Now she was a business leader, a mother, and a woman who understood that true power came not from controlling others, but from knowing her own value. I used to think hiding my wealth would help me find genuine love, she said. But I realize now that I was hiding from myself as much as from potential fortune hunters. And now I know that the right person will love me because of my strength, not in spite of it. Dorothy will grow up knowing that she never has to make herself smaller to make someone else comfortable. Baby Dorothy gurgled happily in her mother's arms, as if agreeing with the sentiment. She was a Montgomery woman, heir to a diamond empire, and the strength of generations of women who had built something lasting and meaningful. Outside the windows of Montgomery Diamond Enterprises, the city hummed with activity, millions of people pursuing their own dreams of success and happiness. But in this quiet moment, surrounded by the evidence of her family's legacy and holding her daughter close, Vivian felt a deep sense of contentment. She had learned the most valuable lesson of all true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or diamonds, but in the knowledge of one's own worth and the strength to build a life that reflected that understanding. And that was an inheritance she could pass on to her daughter with complete confidence. The story of the Montgomery women would continue, each generation building on the wisdom and strength of those who came before, creating a legacy that would shine as brilliantly as the diamonds that had made it all possible.